Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. So excited on this episode to be talking with someone whose work I've followed for some time. One of the masterminds, if I can use the word mastermind, behind a book series that I really enjoyed from a few years ago called Red, as well as someone who's worked in the world of characters like Green Lantern, Black Lightning, Batman and the Signal, and of course, Jaime Reyes, Blue Beetle. Delighted on this episode to be talking with comics creator Cully Hamner. Cully, thank you for jumping in and
Oh,
joining.
glad to be here. And Red was a little bit more than a few years ago. That was actually 20 years ago.
It doesn't feel that long. It really
I know.
doesn't feel that
Every
long.
time somebody kind of makes me aware of that, I have to wince a little bit, So yeah,
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't feel 20 years ago does not feel that long at all, as I was
no, it's
telling
true.
my students today, and they just kind
Yeah,
of looked at me. But yeah, yeah, big fan of that work, and as well as your more recent work
thank you.
as well. Yeah. Curious about what comics have allowed you to do creatively.
Well, I mean, I've always been, even as a child, I mean, I was kind of a story kid. Like I liked narrative. I didn't know what narrative was at the time. I just knew that I liked it.
Hmm.
I liked the idea of coming up with characters and creating premises and situations and I also like to draw a lot. So all of these things sort of came together and gave me an opportunity to tell stories. I don't know if I necessarily would have gone into this if it were just about the drawing. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
If it was just a situation where, oh, you can draw for a living, I don't know if that's really why I started drawing. I started drawing because I liked the idea of creating characters and creating worlds for them to live in and situations for them to deal with. And that's what always fascinated me about comics was it was a narrative technique that was pretty unique. Um, and a lot is made of comics being somewhat similar to movies, and I don't think they are. I think they are their own thing, and they have their own rules. And there's some crossover, there's some overlap, but it is a unique way to tell a story, and that's what it's enabled me to do is kind of live in this world of people who do this, and to do my best to be good at it.
Hmm.
It's always a challenge.
I love what you said there about telling story through pictures because it just speaks to kind of the authoring role of artist. And I know some people go, "Oh,
Yeah.
there's the writer side, there's the artist side," but they really weave together a lot.
They really do, and I think that there's a lot of, and again, this goes back to people kind of wanting to relate it to film. There's always that age old argument that people seem to have, which is who's the director. Okay.
Hmm.
And what I think they really mean is who's the author, who has authorship of
Hmm.
what comic book is, who has the right to call themselves the creator of this narrative. And the answer is that if there's a writer and an artist, you both do.
Yeah.
uh
Yeah.
if you want to publish your script, feel free. Then you are the author of that script. But the minute you want to take that script and turn it into a comic book, you need an artist. It cannot be a comic book without an artist. And the best comic book artists take a script and make decisions, visual decisions, narrative decisions about how best to convey or translate what is described into imagery.
Hmm.
uh if you're a writer of prose, the imagery comes from your prose. It's the prose, the narrative description creates images in your head, but in comics the imagery comes from literal imagery.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what I do, and that's what I live for, is that collaboration, and not just the collaboration between creators, but the collaboration between words and pictures,
Hmm.
creating a sequence of images that create a narrative. And that's,
Yeah.
for me, that's really what it's about. Like I look, I'm as impressed as anybody when I see a really great illustration. I'm more impressed by seeing three or more illustrations that tell me something,
Hmm. Hmm.
or fire my imagination somehow.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
get long-winded about this stuff.
No, you are good. I love it. It's very well said, and
Yeah.
uh, I'm going to kind of jump to my question about collaborators because you're certainly somebody that's made a mark on the medium, and so I'm curious about some of the folks who have been kind along the way, and some of those relationships that have kind of fostered some really creative space for you.
Well, I mean, look, I've worked with a lot of really good writers over the years and had really good creative relationships. I think probably you mentioned Red. That was probably a good place to start. I think a good place where a good point where I think I really started to become myself as a storyteller, as an artist, as opposed to trying to kind of be other people, trying to like do other people's styles and that sort of thing. And that was a book that I did with Warren Ellis.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and I found that he kind of came along at the right time for me, and gave me, as a writer, gave me a lot of space to maneuver. And writers don't necessarily always do that. Sometimes it's a tug of war for who gets to contribute to what ends up being a comic book. um, and I'm not saying that one way or another is right or wrong, but obviously, you have a writer like Alan Moore. I don't know if you've ever seen an Alan Moore script. They're always very dense
Hmm.
and very descriptive. And I have seen some of these scripts as they came into the studio that I used to work at. I've never worked with Mr. Moore, but um, it seems to me, looking at his scripts, they become an exercise in what to leave out,
Hmm.
right? And Warren was the opposite of that. Warren was a lot of, okay, here's what happens, here's what the characters are feeling, but he didn't really ever give me like, oh, it's got to be this shape of panel or this angle or that sort of thing. There was always a lot of room for me to maneuver and contribute and add emotional beats, break things up into more panels than what he had scripted or fewer panels, or there was always a lot of room like that.
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
he was probably, as far as I'm concerned, one of those guys that like, just really, it wasn't I wouldn't say it was bare bones, but he basically just gave me enough for me to run with. But then
Yeah.
on the other hand, you have people like Greg Rucka, who I've had a lot of fruitful collaboration with. I'm working with right now, actually.
Hmm.
And he gives a fair amount of description and a lot about emotional beats and that sort of thing. He's a lot more descriptive than Warren was, but his attitude is always like, add or subtract whatever you want, because I trust you to handle what I've got on the page.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
he knows that, as I always say, it's like I sort of hew to the Hippocratic oath when it comes to a script. Do no harm.
Right.
Like, I may make decisions, I may compress things, I may expand things, I may move something to the next page or that sort of thing, but I will always preserve the narrative that you set up.
Hmm.
uh I will always make, the dialogue that you've written will work with what I draw, but I reserve the right to make narrative decisions, as long as they don't damage anything. So
Hmm.
he's always good. James Robinson is another one that I had a really great collaboration with. I've done a fair amount with him. I worked with him early in my career, and then we reunited to do an arc for the Shade series in,
Hmm.
God, it must have been 2013 or something like that, 10 years ago. Um,
Which
and
also
he's,
doesn't feel that long ago, by
yeah,
the way.
but he's also someone who kind of has a similar outlook that Greg did, which is, hey, if you do something great, it just makes me look great.
Yeah,
So it's a lot of trust your collaborator. Um, but I've worked with a lot of great writers, and but those are three that kind of stand out as kind of mileposts,
nice.
as you put it. Um, so I'd say those three in particular, yeah.
Yeah. And you've worked on a lot of titles. Any particular positive experience that hasn't been mentioned yet? We talked about Red, The Shade, Green
Oh,
Lantern,
sure. I
Black
mean, like,
Lightning. Yeah.
I've worked several times with Dan Jurgens
Mm,
on things, and we always have a good time working together. You know, Scott Snyder, we worked on Batman the Signal, and you know what, there were some things actually that weren't quite so positive during that series, but it ended up being a very informative, positive experience, and I think we came out of it being stronger with each other than
mhm,
we were when we came in. Having a lot more respect for each other at the end of it. So I'd call that a positive experience, even though
mhm.
there were some there were some times during that series when it didn't feel positive, but it just sort of ended up being positive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff like that. I mean, like I would say, I had a lot of I've had my experiences have been more positive post 2000, like in the 20 some odd years since the turn of the century than they were leading up to that. Because I broke in the very early 90s. So I'd say probably the first dozen years of my career is kind of a mixed bag. And I've
Mhm.
post Red, I think like things have been pretty great, actually.
Great. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of story are you especially drawn to when you get a script? What sort of things are you excited to see?
I mean, I'm more drawn to the way a story is told. I don't necessarily have any sort of like I like this genre and I'm drawn to this genre.
Hmm.
Um I to me it's more about subversion or turning something on its ear or doing something interesting. I mean, I'm comfortable with comedy. I'm comfortable with crime stuff. Science fiction. I mean, there are genres that I don't necessarily gravitate to. Like, for example, if you ask me to do, you know, like something that has a lot to do with sword and sorcery or magic or like,
Hmm.
you know sword and horses kind of stuff, wouldn't be necessarily what I would choose to do. But if somebody has an interesting take, that's a different story.
Yeah. Yeah. Worth the drawing of horses.
Yeah, and I don't love drawing horses, I have to say. I don't really love drawing trees either. Not a
Yeah.
fan of drawing trees, which is funny because the book that I'm working on right now has got a lot. It's set in a very rural area, so it's got a lot of trees in it. And I'm
Uh,
like, well, I guess I better figure out how to draw trees.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or at least be comfortable with it, which you clearly are.
I don't know
Yeah.
about that.
Well, that was going to be where I went next, which is sort of the next creative directions, next creative steps. And you mentioned you're working on something with Greg Rucka. I know that titles, details can't always be talked about, but just curious about anything that you'd like to share
Well, I
about
mean,
in
we
progress.
haven't done like I've talked about this publicly at conventions and in a couple of interviews, and we haven't done a major announcement yet.
Hmm.
With art and like all that stuff. We haven't done like a press release or anything, but we've talked about it. I'm doing a book with Greg Rucka. It's a creator-owned series for Image Comics, and it's called Ruby Actual. And we're a couple of issues into it. It's a 5 issue series. I want to return to doing a little bit more creator owned stuff.
Yeah.
Um, which is not to say that, I'm not going to do work for hire, also. I mean, I love doing, stuff with, cool creators and cool characters. And, right after I do, uh, um, Ruby, after I finish Ruby, I've got a one shot doing for Todd McFarlane with
Nice.
Tales of the Violator with Mark Draco. So I'm doing that. That'll be like a 40-page one shot. And I'm always talking to DC about DC and Marvel about doing stuff. So we'll see what pops up after that. They're always in touch. Um, but for my immediate future, it's a creator owned thing with Greg for Image, and then this Violator one shot.
Love it. Love it. Yeah. And I love the sort of the creator owned or even indie spaces because it seems like really interesting directions happen in comics in those spaces.
Yeah, the book that we're doing right now, I mean, it was really born out of a conversation we had in England at Thought Bubble, where we hadn't seen each other in a while, and we basically just we got into a conversation about something that makes both of us very angry,
Hmm.
and we were like, we were both kind of like, this thing that's going on right now really pisses us off, and I really miss working with you, and let's do something, let's do something. And our first thought was, to do something just simple. Well, let's just do a simple revenge story or something. But
Hmm.
us being us, it's sort of subtext starts bleeding into it, and it became a lot more in the doing. So it's actually there's a revenge element to it, but it's not simply about that. There's definitely a political edge to it. There's a societal edge to it. Um, and you'll see when we make a more formal announcement. But for right now, it's just something we're working on, and it's out there. It's going to happen. So
Awesome.
should be cool.
Very exciting. Very
Yeah.
exciting. Looking forward to it. Yeah. I only have one more official question, and then we can
Okay.
hit anything
I
that we've
have an
missed.
official answer, I'm sure.
I'm so glad. I always like to ask about spaces where people can connect. I know I've seen you a couple of times at Heroes Con, so I know that's
Right.
one place that you're frequently at, but also curious about online spaces and things like that as well.
Well, I mean, I've been fairly present, on social media, for the life of social media, really. I mean, I going back to like Friendster, for it's like I've been on Twitter since, what is now X on since 2009. You can find me as at Cully Hamner on that and Blue Sky and Threads, and I have a fan page on Facebook. I've got an Instagram. You can find me in all these places. Just search for me, and I'm
Yeah,
there, and I'm pretty accessible.
yeah. And then as far as those physical spaces, you mentioned Thought Bubble.
Yeah, I've only been the one time. That was back in, I don't know, 2018, 2019, something like that. I would
Hmm.
love to go back. I'm pretty much always at Heroes Con. I try to do New York every year, Chicago, C2E2, I'm thinking I'm going to try. I don't have I haven't been given my official, list of cons this year yet.
Hmm.
Probably won't get it till closer to the end of the year. So it'll be a few weeks, but I'm thinking I'm going to try and do Emerald City,
Hmm.
in Seattle. I'm going to try and do San Diego this year. I haven't been in about 7 or 8 years. Um,
Yeah.
so that's something I'm going to try to do. And a few others. I think MegaCon. I think I'll probably do that one. So we'll see. We'll see where I end up. You can always catch me at Heroes. That's like a perennial for me.
Yeah, it's a good show.
Yeah.
Very good show. Yeah. I heard San Diego was great
Baltimore.
for
That's another
creators
good one.
this year.
Yeah. I'm always at Baltimore.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard great things about that one as well.
Another good one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know that I tend to do brief talks, but I also want to make sure that I honor the time. Is there anything that we missed that you want to make sure to share before we close
No, I'm
out?
at your disposal. I mean, whatever you wanted to ask me, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds great, and I appreciate everything that you've shared. I guess I made that reference to you making a mark on comics in a way. So maybe a closing question about that, about at this point, looking back and looking forward, kind of I guess where you see the industry going might be part of that, but also how does it feel at this point to have made such a mark in the creative world?
It's funny because I don't really look at it that way, and I've never really. And part of that's just my personality. I just don't think in terms of like I've done anything that anybody would consider important or anything. And I know that probably sounds disingenuous to people listening to this, but I don't look at it in those terms. I don't
Mhm.
sort of sit around and go, well, I've done these things, but I
It's
will
probably
say,
healthy.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a weird thing that I just kind of reject it. But I have had people, especially this year. I mean, I've had a lot of people tell me how important Jaime Reyes is to them.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I saw that. When the movie was about to come out, they had set up a lot of the PR people attached to the film, and
Hmm.
Warner Brothers set up a lot of screenings, trying to get some grassroots support because it was during the strike, and the actors couldn't promote it.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, they couldn't really do anything to promote the movie, so they were trying like sort of a grassroots approach,
Yeah.
and they held a lot of screenings around Texas and in Austin, and seeing heavily Latino screenings, like families at these things, and seeing how emotional they were about it
Yeah.
really kind of set me back on my heels a little bit,
Hmm.
because when you're doing this, when I'm doing the comic, which is what, 2006,
Hmm.
I'm not thinking in terms of well, as far as I knew, nobody was reading it. I mean, I didn't really know. I mean, I thought maybe some hardcore fans were reading it. I didn't really see it in terms of, like, it was making a mark on anyone. So, um, to find out, 15, 16, 17 years later, that people grew up with the character, and came to know him not just through the comics, but through cartoons, and
Hmm.
and that sort of thing, and that they're sharing it with their kids, is kind of mind blowing for me, because I never really thought I would make any sort of a mark. I thought I was lucky to just continue to get work, because
Hmm.
it's not like there aren't a lot of comic book artists out there. So, anyone who comes up to me and tells me I've made a mark, my instinct is to go, right, but that is definitely something that seems to have stood the test of time.
Hmm.
Um, so it's pretty gratifying. And as far as where comics is going, I'm not a doomsayer. I know a lot of people are always kind of doing, oh, comics are dying.
Right.
It's like what Michael Corleone says in Godfather Part Two. He's like, uh, uh, the guy he's trying to make a deal with. He's like, he's been dying of the same heart attack for 20 years. Comics have been dying of the same heart attack for longer than 20 years. And we've
Hmm.
got it ingrained in our heads that this is a dying medium and nobody pays attention. And I'm like, everybody pays attention. How many times do you see these giant media stories, out of something that happens in comics, when a
Yeah.
character dies or something, and it's all over, Variety, or
Hmm.
when, just recently, I mean, to bring it back around to Blue Beetle, when Keith Giffen passed away just recently,
Hmm.
that was a big story in Variety and the Hollywood Reporter and the New York Times, and it was everywhere. That sort of thing tells me that comics aren't nothing, and comics aren't dying, and it's a valid art form, and it's a medium, and it's something that, you know Hollywood pays attention to, because they keep making movies out of what we do.
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and they're licensing bonanzas if you play it right. So people do like what we do, and they do value it. And maybe the comics themselves appeal to a very specific subset of the culture, but what we create propagates throughout the rest of the culture. So I
Yeah.
think that's important, and it's real, and I don't think comics are going anywhere. I think that we're right here, and we have ebbs and flows, and we have times when the comics sell well. We're probably in a bit of a down period right now, but it's self-correcting. We'll fix it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and lots of great creative work being done
Yeah,
at the same
I
time.
think
And
so. So I'm a cheerleader for comics.
love it, love it. Same here, same here. And I'll also add, I was one of the people seeing Blue Beetle in the theater.
Good
Love the
man.
love. Oh yes, yeah. Love the love that it's been getting since it's hit streaming, and
Yeah.
excited to see what is ahead for that character on the screen.
Yeah, me too. And there will be a future for the character. James Gunn has been pretty vocal about that. I think
Mhm.
it's the he Jaime is going to show up in other movies. I think people's reaction to that is going to determine whether we ever get a Blue Beetle 2.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the movie did not do, like, astounding business in the theater, and there were some factors that contributed to that.
Hmm.
I think there's a general malaise to the theater going experience right now, just not just for Blue Beetle, but just for everything. I mean,
Yeah.
your Oppenheimer and Barbie notwithstanding, most movies are not doing that well right now.
Hmm. Hmm.
in the theaters. So it has been very nice to see a lot of people discover it on streaming and really kind of give it a round of applause and talk about it online. It's still trending from what
Yeah,
I could see. So I think it's a good
absolutely.
thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Love it. Love the cheerleading for comics. And Cully, thank you so much for the time
Well, thanks for
and
having me.
for the
Yeah.
kindness. Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Glad to have you anytime.
Awesome. Thank you.